Welcome to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. My name is Ernie Lawrence. Today we're going to be studying Judges chapter 18. Now, 17 through 21 is a portion of the book of Judges that is kind of out of sync with the rest of it. Samuel is not writing in a way where it's supposed to be fully chronological. He's not writing that way. He's more writing in terms of an anthology here. And what has been put at the end is kind of a beginning. And note that in 17 and here again in 18, it talks about there's no king. This is the way that Israel is acting. Everybody's doing right in their own minds. And so this is the time kind of bleeding over with the idea of Joshua. And you have the Danites are, remember, there were parts over with the Philistines that they didn't conquer like they were supposed to. And so at the end of Joshua's life, you have, even though the promise has been fulfilled, the promise was fulfilled as far as the Israelites were willing to obey God. And so when Joshua passes away, they declare, hey, all the land promise has been fulfilled. But the Danites still haven't fully embraced all the land that they had been given. They failed to kick out people. There were a lot of places, even though the land belonged to them now, they failed to kick out people. And so we can see in Joshua that God does declare, hey, I fulfilled my promise to you. But because of the rebelliousness of the people and the failure of them to heed God in all of the ways that they should, there were people that remained in their land that they hadn't quite kicked out yet. And so we're going to read kind of one of those stories here of the Danites where they're just beyond Joshua. We don't have a king anymore. We don't have a ruler. We don't have anybody that is over all of Israel at this point because Joshua has passed away. And so what happens is without that strong leadership, everybody is kind of doing whatever they think is right or whatever they want to do in their own minds. And so in Joshua chapter 18, what you see is an account that is bleeding over from 17, where these Danites are going in to take out the city of Laish. Now, remember in 17, you have the story of Micah. He and his mother had a little back and forth. She was upset because some money had been gone missing, and he shows up. He says, I took the money. She blessed him because he was honest about it. And they made some graven images, and then a Levite comes along, and they're like, hey, come be our priest. And that's kind of the setting. And they give him his own house. The priest has his own house that's a little up the way from Micah. And he is now their priest. And I guess they're kind of this hybrid religion that they have going on. They have idols in their home. They also have this Levitical priest. So it's kind of like they're playing both sides here. And that's where we find ourselves at the beginning of chapter 18. So it says in verse 1, in those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites sought them an inheritance to dwell in. For unto that day all their inheritance had not fallen unto them among the tribes of Israel. Again, this is over on the west side of the promised land, and remember, they did not kick the Philistines out like they were supposed to. If you go back and you read Joshua, or you look at the videos I've done on Joshua, you see that even though God had declared the land promise fulfilled, they had failed to, the people had failed, not God. The people had failed to kick out the Philistines and the other people that they were supposed to over on the west coast. And so they were a thorn in their side the entire time. The Danites are one of those groups that has failed to do the things that God had said. And this is going to come back. This is going to be an important thing to understand when we get into the New Testament, especially into the book of Revelation. Okay, so they're seeking their inheritance. They're going out to the west. And so the children of Dan sent of their family 5 men from their coasts, men of valor from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. So these guys are spies. They're very good at what they do. And they said, go search the land. So when they came to Mount Ephraim to the house of Micah, they lodged there. So now you have these 5 men. They're heading into the area that they're spying for Dan to take over, like they're supposed to do. And they come to the house of Micah, and they stay there. Um, when they were by the house of Micah, they knew the voice of the young man, the Levite, and they turned to there and said unto him, who has brought you here, and what do why are you in this place? What are you doing for this guy Micah? What makest thou in this place, and what hast thou here? And so they recognize this Levite. He's young, but they recognize who he is, and they're like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And um, remember, he doesn't live in the house with Micah. He has his own house up the way, but he's close enough that they hear his voice probably during one of the periods of worship or whatever. And so they like, hey, we recognize you. We know you. What are you doing here? And so he says in verse 4, he said unto them, thus and thus dealeth Micah with me, and hath hired me, and I am his priest. So he explains, the priest of Levi explains to them all that he has going on with Micah. Said he's hired me, and I'm his priest. And they said, okay, so you're a Levitical priest. They recognized who he was. And they said, ask counsel, we pray you, of God, that we may know whether our way which we go shall be prosperous. So they asked this Levitical priest the right thing. At this moment in time, because of who they recognize him to be, the Danite spies are doing the right thing. They are asking of God, which is what the children of Israel should be doing. We see from Joshua, we see the Israelites knowing, hey, we need to ask God before we do this or that. We have to ask what we should be doing, and they're supposed to be going to God for their decisions, and they would go through the priesthood to do this. So here they recognize a Levitical priest, and they say, ask God if what we're doing is the right thing to do. Okay? The priest responds to them, go in peace, before Yahweh, before Jehovah is your way wherein you go. In other words, you're doing what God wants you to do, you're doing the right thing. For one, we have a priest here who is part and parcel of idol worship. He's been invited into the house of Micah, who has idols, and the priest has not told Micah to get rid of the idols. He's just there getting paid. We aren't told that the priest actually goes and talks to God. We're only told that he answers as if God had said something to him. And we aren't told whether he is actually relaying a message from God, or whether he is telling the Danites just something they want to hear, or whatever. There's a lot of Balaam in this Levite that we're seeing here. He's wanting money. He's wanting to be a priest to this guy Micah. He's wanting to kind of have his cake and eat it too, if you will. And so there's a lot of things going on here, and we're going to see here in just a minute that the spies are paying attention to more than what we're told right at this moment, and it's going to cause some problems. And so the priest tells him, you can go. And so the 5 men depart and came to Laish. Now Laish is a town, and when they're at this town, they see some things that they're, as spies, that they're going to take back to their people. It's very important that you understand. They saw the people that were therein, how they dwelt careless. In other words, it wasn't when we think of the idea of careless, sometimes we get a bad idea. We think, oh, somebody's being very careless. What it means is they are without care. They live their lives, and there isn't anything that they're worried about, that they're seeing. Like they don't necessarily have defenses up. They're not worried about being attacked, those kinds of things. But they dwelt careless after the manner of the Zidonians, quiet and secure. So this gives us an idea that the town of Laish they were at peace. They didn't have any concerns or worries about anything. And it says that there was no magistrate in the land that might put them to shame in anything. So these people lived pretty much how they wanted to. It wasn't like an anarchy or anything, but they didn't have a feudal lord over them. They weren't close enough to any other place that could defend them. And so you just have this town by itself. And uh, they were far from the Zidonians, and they didn't really communicate with other towns very often. It says they had no business with any man. And so you have what the spy sees. The spy sees a town ripe for the taking. So they spy out this land, they spy out this city, Laish. They see that it's kind of ripe for the taking. And so then they go back and report in verse 8. It says, they came unto their brethren to Zorah and Eshtaol, and their brethren said unto them, what do you say? What did you find out? And they said, arise that we may go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And are you still? In other words, why are you sitting around? Don't be slothful to go to enter to possess the land. In other words, we need to go and take the land. So again, up to this point, the Danite spies, as far as we can tell, are doing the right thing. They have asked God for guidance through the Levite. They are doing what they're commanded to do, to go take and possess the land the way God commanded them to do it. They're saying, don't be slothful. Let's right for the taking. Let's go. Okay, very much learning the lesson of Numbers 14, where the spies went in and said, we can't do it, they're too big. Now they're doing what appears to be the right thing. So it says in verse 10, when you go, you shall come into a people secure, into a large land. For God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no want of anything that is in the earth. And so they describe this land, and these people are secure. That is, kind of like when we look in various books of prophecy, and even into the New Testament, where it talks about that the people think that there's peace, there's going to be this time of peace, and nobody's going to bother us, and then suddenly there's going to be war that comes upon them. This is Laish is like that. In a lot of ways, we're kind of seeing a precursor here to what the Jews themselves would eventually face. And so there went out from the family of the Danites, out of Zorah and Eshtaol, 600 men appointed with weapons of war. And so you have 600 men leave from where the Danites are, and they're heading down to Laish. And they went up and pitched in Kirjath-jearim in Judah, so they're passing through Judah to get there. Wherefore they called that place Hanadon unto this day. Behold, it is behind Kirjath-jearim. So this is, again, when we read this, we're reading this from the time perspective of Samuel who's writing. This is after all these. Remember, Samuel is kind of the last judge. He's also a priest, and he is the one that anoints the first king, Saul. So this is the time period that we're reading this in. We're way past this. We're almost we're probably a little beyond 300 years afterward is when Samuel's writing this, and so we're reading it from that perspective. Okay, but that's why he's saying things like it's still called that today, because we're centuries later. And it says in verse 13, and they passed from there to Mount Ephraim, and they came into the house of Micah. So these 600 men, along with the 5 spies, come to the land that Micah owns. And the 5 spies report to the men that are with them. They said, it says, they answered the 5 men that went out to spy out the country of Laish, and said unto their brethren, did you know that there is in this house, or in these houses, because we're talking about the Levite's house and Micah's house, an ephod, a teraphim, and a graven image, and a molten image. So there's 2 images. There's also a teraphim and an ephod, which are like priestly garments and stuff. Now, therefore, consider what you have to do. So they say, these are the things that we spied the last time that we came through. So they were spies, they were paying attention, and they saw these things within. And then they tell their fellow men, their fellow Dannites, hey, this is all the stuff that we're seeing inside these houses. And so they turned in that direction and came to the house of the young man, the Levite. So they're not coming to the house of Micah yet. It says they came to the house of the young man, the Levite. It says, even unto the house of Micah, and saluted him. But that this idea of the house of Micah here is not that they're at Micah's dwelling place. They're actually on the Levites' little kind of house to the side. Think of it as like a mother-in-law suite or something like that. It's a house that's off to the side where the Levite lives by himself. And then the whole property is that of Micah's. And that's kind of the gist that I get here in reading through this, because we're going to see later that they actually come to the house of Micah and past that. And it's a different dwelling place. So they come to him and they salute him. You know, they're polite to him. And the 600 men appointed with their weapons of war, which were the children of Dan, stood by the entering of the gate. So they don't come onto the property. They wait politely outside. There's something, I think, of an implied threat here, but it's like seeing a bunch of guys that have guns, but the guns are holstered or they're strapped to the back. You know that there's a show of force, but these guys are not threatening in that sense. And so the 5 men that went out to spy the land went up and came in there, and this is into the Levite's house, and took the graven image and the ephod and the teraphim and the molten image. And the priest stood in the entering of the gate with the 600 men that were appointed with weapons of war. So what they do, and what I'm getting from this house is, this is kind of not only the place where the Levite lives, but this is also kind of like a little chapel, what we would call a chapel today. I'm not sure what they would call it back then, but the Levite not only lives here, but he works here. This is where they come to worship. And so you have the Levite actually waits out at the gate with the 600 men while the spies go in and they take all of these things. Okay? So they take the ephod and the teraphim, they take the molten image. Doesn't say anything at this point about the engraven image, but these are the things that they take. And then in verse 18 it says, and these went into Micah's house to fetch the carved image, the ephod and teraphim and the molten image. And the priest said unto them, what are you doing? So the priest is there with them. And when it says Micah's house, it's talking about the little chapel, not into Micah's house specifically. And they're grabbing all of these things. So they take both images. They take the ephod and the teraphim. And the priest is like, what are you doing? And they said unto him, just hold on, hold your peace, put your hand on your mouth, be silent, and go with us. So they're trying to be sneaky about it. And they're taking all of these things, and they're like, hey, why don't you go with us? Be to us a father and a priest. So they're offering essentially an upgrade to this priest. Now, so far, what they're doing is they're taking the ephod, the teraphim, the molten image, and the carven image or the graven image out of this chapel. And up until this point, we don't have the idea that they're doing anything wrong, because if they're taking them out to destroy them, fine. And if they're calling the priest out of participating in this hybrid idolatry kind of thing, fine. Up to this point, we don't have any indication that the Dannites are doing anything wrong. So they invite this guy to come be a father and a priest to them. Is it better for you to be a priest in the house of one man, or that you be a priest unto the tribe and a family in Israel? So they're upgrading his job. Don't be a priest to just this one guy, be a priest to Dan. And that sounds great, but there's no chastisement here. Hey, but we're not going to do the whole idol thing. That's what they should have said. We're going to destroy these, and we're not going to do that part, but you come be a proper priest to us. That's what they should have been doing. But the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod and the teraphim and the graven image and went in the midst of the people. Okay, so instead of doing the right thing, the Danites, all they did was take the idols, take the priest. They basically just stole these things for them. So in verse 21, it says, so they turned and departed and put the little ones and the cattle and the carriage before them. The little ones here and the cattle and the carriage, these are all property of the Levite, the guy that's going to go with them. They're not stealing Micah's children. They're not stealing his cattle or anything. What they're doing is they're taking the property of the Levite who is going to go with them. Okay, so they go on down the road. Remember, they haven't actually gone from Micah's house. They haven't really gone to the structure where Micah himself lives. And it says, and when they were a good way from the house of Micah, the men that were in the houses, plural, near to Micah's house, were gathered together and overtook the children of Dan. So you have some of the people that are servants of Micah, and they overtake this kind of small army, 600, and they cried unto the children of Dan, and they turned their faces and said unto Micah, what's wrong? Why do you come with such a company? Okay, so they you've got Micah and you've got all of these people here, and they're coming out, and they're like, what's wrong with you? Why are you coming with such a big group of people? And he said, you have taken away my gods, which I made. That phrase right there is just dumb to me. My gods that I'm going to worship, that I made. That, I don't know why that phrase just strikes me as so stupid, but if you make something and then you worship it, you're an idiot. That's all I can say. It's just ridiculous to even think that way for me. Now, apparently for these people, it's part and parcel, but that's what they do. It says, you have taken away my gods, which I made, and the priest, and you are gone away, and what do I have left? And what is this that you say unto me? What's wrong with you? It's like, you stole my gods, you stole my priests, you've taken all the religious stuff, and then you're asking me why I'm upset? What's wrong with me? Okay, so he has a good point, but they're kind of doing this guy a favor by taking a bad priest and all of these idols away from him. But verse 25, and the children of Dan said unto him, let not your voice be heard among us. In other words, shut up. Don't talk, lest angry fellows run upon thee, and you lose your life with the lives of your household. So here's the threat. Finally, we get to the threat, and they're like, look, you need to just shut up, because if you keep talking, some of the guys in our group are going to get mad, and you don't have any control over them, and they're just going to kill you and all these people that are part of your household. Apparently, Micah didn't have 600 people. He maybe had, let's say, 20 or something like that, a much smaller number. And he comes up to this small army of 600, and says, hey, you stole our stuff. And you have these 600 guys going, are you serious? What's wrong with you? There's 600 of us, and if you don't stop complaining, we're just going to take your life too. And we're going to kill all the guys that came with you. So this goes from potentially the Danites doing what they were supposed to just kind of a theft. And it's kind of disappointing to see that during this time period when they're supposed to be doing what God has given them to do, which is to take the promised land and carve out that area for themselves that God has blessed them with, that because of the lack of strong leadership, they're just committing highway robbery. And so the children of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he did what they said. He shut up and went away. He turned and went back to his house. And they took the things which Micah had made, and the priest which he had, and came to Laish unto a people that were quiet and secure, and they smote them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire. So they basically took them out. They come to this peaceful city. Again, these people are not, they're in the promised land, but these are pagans. They are worshiping false gods. God has given them the authority to come in and run them out. So they take over the town, they burn parts of it, and they kill. We know later that from other passages later in the Old Testament that they aren't going through and just completely committing genocide. They're basically fighting against the men, and they're killing some, which is part of war, but the rest are being kicked out. And so they smite them, they burn the city with fire, but obviously they don't burn the whole city, because they actually take the city over. And there was no deliverer. In other words, Laish didn't have somebody to come rescue them during the fight, because it was far from Zidon. And the Zidonians they weren't part of that little city state, that little fiefdom that the city states usually represented. And so they didn't have any business with any man. And it was in the valley that lies by Beth Rehob. They built a city and dwelt therein. And so you have a place here that's kind of isolated. It's in a valley. And because of its isolation, it became ripe for the picking. And so these Danites come in, they take it over, they burn the city, destroy a lot of it, but on that spot, they essentially build a new city and dwell therein, and they call the name of the city Dan. So this is the city of Dan, and by the Danites, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born unto Israel. Howbeit, the name, and when it says born, who was born unto Israel, that means the man. Dan is the son of Jacob. Howbeit, the name of the city was Laish at first. So when they rebuild the city, they rebuild it and they call it Laish at first. And then they kind of have a dedication, I guess, and rename it to Dan after that. But this is why I think that they didn't fully burn it down and they rebuilt on the spot, is because initially they called it Laish until they renamed it. And then it says, the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Okay, so you have at this time, at the very beginning of this time when Dan is getting its land that had been promised to it, they set up a graven image in this town of Dan, which is going to become kind of the capital of the tribe of Dan. They set up a graven image, and then they have this priesthood, these Levitical priests who were supposed to lead the people in the right way, and they have this hybrid religion this whole time. So they set up these images, and it says, until the day of the captivity of the land. I don't know that this captivity of the land is until the Assyrian captivity, when you have the splitting of the two kingdoms, and then the northern kingdoms going to. I don't think that that's what this is talking about. I think, remember, if you will, that this is prior to any of the actual judges, and I think that what you have here is up until the captivity of Dan in some of those other stories, when other kings came in, little city-state kings came in and took over and subjugated the tribes of Israel. And you see that all through the book of Judges that we've already gone over. Okay, so don't get when we think of, hindsight, we think of captivity of the land, we think of the Assyrian captivity for the tribe of Dan. And I don't think that's what this is talking about. And they set them up, Micah's graven image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So I think that gives us a better time period when we talk about the house of God. Remember, this is before Saul, before David, before Solomon, and so we're before the temple. The temple hasn't been built yet. We don't get to the temple until like First Kings. And so the house of God was in Shiloh. That means the tabernacle. And so the entire time that the tabernacle is in Shiloh, you have these graven images that the tribe of Dan is worshiping. And that's a very important story. This whole section here of 17 to 21 is an important story because it tells us how Dan is to be treated. So, and I will cover that as we go along, as we move into more of the book of Judges and more into other books of the Bible. I don't want to kind of jump the gun here at this point in time. I just want to highlight Dan's unfaithfulness to God. That it was pretty much right after Joshua passed away, and pretty much up until the time that we're talking about the tabernacle and stuff like that. And then they go with the northern tribes, and there was never a good king, and so forth. So Dan is pictured as a pretty unfaithful tribe from here is the point to make. So anyway, that is the end of the chapter. Hopefully we'll get to do a few more here this week, as most of my classes have spring break. Thank you for joining me for Judges chapter 18. As always, I look forward to your comments and questions. My name is Ernie Lawrence, and this has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation, and we will see you next time.